This presentation is entitled The Source of Knowing. How do we know what we know? And I open with a quote by Richard King from his book Indian Philosophy. I quote, "How do we know what we know? This is a question that has plagued thinkers throughout the history in a variety of different cultures and philosophical traditions. In classical Indian thought, questions about the nature, means, and source of knowledge, the discipline known as epistemology to modern philosophers, is summed up in the Sanskrit notion of pramana. Pramana is defined as a source or means of valid apprehension or valid knowledge. One cannot expect to possess valid knowledge without first having some means or way of apprehending it. The means for such knowledge is known as pramana." And I end the quote. Yoga recognizes that the mind becomes confused and, at times, deluded, and that our perception can become distorted through prejudiced or past experience. A practice is the means to clarify our perception. My father died in 2013 after a short decline. In the preparation for his funeral, I spoke to his surviving sisters and to other family members. As I prepared a eulogy to read at the funeral, I spoke to his old friends. I held the man via the memories of those who spoke to me over those few days. As a young child, I lived on a farm in western New South Wales. My father worked as a share farmer, and the family lived in a fibro house provided by the owner. The farm was named Urona, about 20 miles from Coonabarabran. Over the period of my father's decline and subsequent gathering of the family for the funeral, my three sisters and I gathered, and stories about our growing up in our family were exchanged, as is always the case. For example, the time my eldest sister nearly burned down the hay shed as she experimented with matches and set the grass alight, or when, as a crawling baby, I was pulled hair first from the dam after my father saw bubbles in the muddied water whilst on a family picnic. Ours is like all families, with myths and stories, but what is the truth of these stories? Throughout these exchanges, I was extremely aware that each story was real, and each story held something of the truth, and yet was not the whole truth, nor the only perspective. Two things stood out for me that reflect the principles acknowledged in yogic thought and confirmed through my own experience. The first is that the perception of objects change dependent on the position of the viewer. And secondly, that we experience things at a point in time. In going through my father's papers, I came across this photo, and no one has been able to tell me much about it. What does this photo say? The issues here reflect the issues yoga acknowledges. Historically, it's been said that yoga accepts three types of knowing. They are direct perception, testimony, and inference. When I think about this photo and direct perception, if I could have been there, I would know things from direct experience. When I think of testimony, what would my father say about this photo? And lastly, inference. What can we know from what we can see in the details of the photo? The dress of the women, the location, the buildings. And here I summarize Richard King in his book. He talks about a friend who goes to the desert and has an experience of a camel. My friend comes back and tells me about a camel. And I listen to this description of a long-necked beast with a hump and broad-based feet for walking in sand. And I don't need to believe my friend, although he sounds convinced. But when I, at a later point, go to the desert and see a camel directly, it helps me to understand what I'm seeing and not to mistake this beast for a horse, for example. So testimony can help clarify what I am experiencing. And again, in relation to inference, astronomers indicate that black holes exist. We cannot see a black hole, but we can infer its existence from the behavior of what we can observe. What this photo raises for me is being able to inhabit this point in time. If only I could go to that moment to see what was happening, what was said, and what happened in the moments leading up to and after the photo. I recognize too that as I look from another point in time, that my perception may be distorted. Here is another image. It was taken during the American Civil War. It is of a dead sharpshooter taken by Alexander Gardner in July 1863. There was great consternation when it was discovered that he had repositioned the rifle and the body to create a more dramatic effect. It was considered that he had both desecrated the grave and had manipulated the truth. Things have moved a long way now with Photoshop, but the same issues remain for us. Photos contain stories, but are those stories real? What is now more widely accepted today is that my perception changes depending on where I stand in relation to the event. There's a famous story that illustrates this, as noted in the parable, referred to as the elephant parable. A number of disciples went to the Buddha and said, "Sir, there are many wandering hermits and scholars living here who indulge in constant dispute. Some saying the world is infinite and eternal, and others that it is finite and not eternal. Some saying that the soul dies with the body, and others that it lives on forever. What would you say about these scholars?" The Buddha answered, "Once upon a time there was a Raja, a king, who called to his servants and said, 'Go and gather together in one place all the men who are born blind, and show them an elephant.' 'Very good, sir,' replied the servants, and did as they were told. The Raja said to the blind men, 'Here is an elephant.' To one man he presented the ears, to another the trunk, and another the tail, to another the leg, and another the tusk, and to another the side of the elephant. When the blind men had felt the elephant, the Raja went to each of them and said, 'Well, have you seen the elephant? Tell me, what sort of thing is it?' Thereupon the man who had observed the ear said, 'Sir, an elephant is like a fan.' And the man who had been presented with the tusk said it was like a spear. 'An elephant is like a tree,' said the man who knew only the leg. And another said that the elephant was a wall or a rope. Then they all began to quarrel, shouting, 'Yes, it is, and no, it isn't. An elephant's not this, it is that,' and so on, until they came to blows over the matter. The Raja was delighted. Buddha said to his disciples, just as these preachers and scholars are holding specific views, they become blind and unseen. In their ignorance, they are by nature quarrelsome, wrangling, and disputatious, each maintaining reality is thus and thus. Such folk see only one side of a thing. In the parable, there are two teachers. First, the Buddha, who was asked by his disciples what he has to say concerning the scholars who are in the dispute, and the Raja, who was the one who asked his servants to bring the blind men to the elephant. What we're seeing here is a method being applied by these two teachers. The Buddha did not engage in theoretical explanations in his attempt to help his disciples, find the answer to their questions. The Buddha told the story of the Raja. The story of the Raja is as powerful today as it was hundreds or even thousands of years ago. It is a story to conjure images and relates quickly to a part of the brain that allows the truth to surface. A universal truth, and yet a very personal truth. What is relevant here is that we, as humans, take hold of an idea and we make this truth the only truth. And, as humans, we have the capacity to recognize this tendency within ourselves, understanding that we have a capacity to watch ourselves, understanding that we have a view of who we think we are, and then to recognize that this is only one view. If the Buddha had tried to give an answer to his disciples by way of intellectual explanation, the result would likely have been a replication of the rabble depicted in the parable. Each disciple would likely argue that they had heard the explanation most clearly and that they were correct in their interpretation. If the Buddha's choice of teaching, in the Buddha's choice of teaching, each disciple is left with an image, a point of reflection about the experiences that are observed within humanity. What this parable teaches us is that we need to test the veracity of our knowing, to ensure that what appears to be evident or truth may only be partial. We need a way to test our knowing. What we see in these examples are that our perception is affected by these two things. Firstly, the point in time. This in effect means that I don't necessarily have the complete story. And secondly, position in relation to an object. My relationship to the events may distort my perception. The term Iyengar Yoga was coined to describe the method of teaching yoga that BKS Iyengar developed. However, he says, and I quote, "I have no right to brand my method of practice and teaching as Iyengar Yoga. It is my pupils that call it Iyengar Yoga to distinguish it from the teachings of others. Though I am rational, I am a man of sentiment and tradition bound. I trust the statements of others, follow their lines of explanation, and experiment with them to gain experience. If my experience tallies with their expressions, I accept their statements. Otherwise, I discard them, live by my own experiments and experiences, and make my pupils feel the same as I felt in my experiments. If many agree, then I take it as a proven fact and I impart it to others. The only thing I am doing is to bring out the in-depth, hidden qualities of yoga to the awareness of you all. This has made you call my way of practice and teaching Iyengar Yoga. This label has caught on and become widely known. But what I do is nevertheless purely authentic traditional yoga. It is wrong to differentiate traditional yoga from Iyengar Yoga. End of quote. Throughout his life, B.K.S. Iyengar has dedicated himself to a practice that aims at experiential knowledge. Through this practice, he has developed a methodology that applies four fundamental principles. The first of these is technique. It comprises alignment, precision and performance, and the use of props and supports. Secondly, the use of timings. It involves the use of holdings to study an asana, to change one's capacity, and to study oneself. Sequence is an ordering of the asanas in the practice to broaden the understanding and perception of an asana and of oneself. And lastly, repetition. Repetition is applied when we return again and again over time to mature an asana. Effectively, repetition confirms understanding and clarifies the mind. As students in the Iyengar lineage, we apply the methodology systematically within our practice. We study Iyengar's vast body of practice experience objectively. This objective knowledge is used to develop a profound experiential knowledge in practice by these four methods. Ultimately, we apply Iyengar's methodology to study cause and effect via the practice of asana and pranayama. We study the tendencies of the mind and watch its behavior within a practice-based learning paradigm. Each level of the practitioner program at Yoga Mandir provides classes in yogasana, pranayama, and led practice, where students study the practice and come to this profound experiential knowing. In essence, Yoga Mandir seeks to deliver knowledge from one's own experience.